Hola, buenos días. Me llamo Yomaira Figueroa Vázquez. Good morning. Buenos días. Me llamo Yomaira Figueroa Vázquez, and I'm the Directora Centro, the Center for Puerto Rican Studies, the largest university-based research institute, library, and archive dedicated to the Puerto Rican experience in the United States. We just turned 51, so but we're gonna ride this 50th for as long as we can. I want to, before I talk a little bit about what we're gonna do today, I wanted to thank José for envisioning this. It is through his work as a research associate and a deep researcher in our archives that this event came to be, and he was able to bring it into fruition with the beautiful support of the Central staff who are so dedicated, and I'm so honored to be able to work with. I also want to thank the Clemente Soto Vélez Center, Agitarte, y La Sala de Pepe for also co-sponsoring this event with us. It's so critical for us to really reach deep and collaborate with our community in ways that make clear our commitments to one another and to our futures. Yeah. So thank you for joining us here in person, and for those on Zoom, we had a very large number of RSVPs. We're so happy that folks are here. And before we begin, I want to acknowledge that we are on the unceded and ceded territories of the Lenape Hoking indigenous peoples who were displaced here and on whose land which slavery was brought as a result of settler colonialism, something that we understand very deeply as a Puerto Rican people, right? This history, long history of colonialism in Puerto Rico over 500 years and here over 400 years. Today is an auspicious day because it was today on March 1st in 1954 that Lolita Lebron led a group of 4 members of the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party in an armed attack on the US Congress to dramatize the ongoing colonial nature of the territorial relationship in the wake of the Commonwealth Constitution of 1952. 70 years later, while perspectives on the preferred solution may vary, there remains little doubt as to the colonial nature of our relationship with the United States as Puerto Ricans, especially following the imposition by Congress of an unelected Fiscal Oversight Board, or La Junta, in 2016. The political landscape in Puerto Rico seems to be shifting in dramatic and previously unexpected ways since then. The various tactical, discursive, and effective practices are nurtured by a long tradition of anti-colonial and anti-capitalist politics in the archipelago as well as the diaspora. This symposium seeks to cast new light on this ever-evolving selective tradition by effacing artificial barriers between archipelagic and diasporic past, present, and futures, as well as trying to traverse the artificial boundaries between activists and scholars and particular struggles within this expansive and dialogic radical movement space. All of the panelists today are part of this radical tradition in some way, either as catalysts for change or as writers, thinkers, scholars, and artists who work and believe in this tradition. We're starting the symposium with Centro Research Associate José Ramirez, who will lead us in rethinking the radical tradition of Puerto Rican politics. He is a transdisciplinary scholar trained in political science, anthropology, and law. Born in San Juan, he first arrived in New York City in 1997 and has been a participant and observer of social and political movements on both sides of La Guagua area. He is currently working on a book manuscript called, well, tentatively called, Crisis Projects, Colonial Capitalism and the Puerto Rican Radical Tradition, 1996 to 2019. In his introduction, Ramirez explores the concept of radical traditions borrowed directly from scholars writing on the Black radical tradition and the ways the tradition has been addressed by Puerto Rican studies in the past. And finally, I would be remiss if I did not take a moment to acknowledge the atrocities that are happening worldwide, not just here in our community, but also in Palestine. We are deeply committed to the liberation of the Palestinian people. Puerto Ricans have a long history of this deep connection and affiliation. And we are deeply understanding that a ceasefire is the bare minimum that needs to happen. And I hope that with this day that we're focusing on the Puerto Rican radical tradition, we can also lend some of our minds and our hearts to think about our family and extended communities in other places of the world who are also seeing unprecedented levels of violence, displacement, and death. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Figueroa Velázquez. Thank you to all our wonderful panelists and moderators. Thank you to everyone in Centro's events, communications, and graphic design teams, in the library and archives, and everyone who has worked hard to make this event possible. Shout out to my colleagues in the Research Associates program for their constant encouragement and support. Thanks to our partners, the Clemente Cultural Education Center, Agitarte, and La Sala de Pepe, and to all the CUNY departments, organizations, and individuals that also helped to spread the word. Very special thank you to community members Carmen Vivian Rivera and Gary Cruz for providing many of the images that you will see during panels 1 and 3. Thank you all for being here with us today. I want to echo Dr. Figueroa Velázquez's words regarding the historical violences that underlay the space that we are occupying here today, as well as acknowledging the atrocities that are committed around the world, particularly in Palestine. And I want to add that we should not begin an academic event on a radical tradition without acknowledging the right of all human beings to resist colonialism and colonization by any means necessary. In recent years, indeed, no one on earth has paid as high a price for resolutely upholding this right as the people of Palestine. As Sarah Abertani and others have shown in their research, anti-colonial solidarity between Palestine and Puerto Rico is a deep and enduring part of our two peoples' respective radical traditions. As this latest onslaught in a long history of calculated and systematic violence against Palestinians continues, I want to join Dr. Figueroa Velázquez in calling for an immediate and permanent ceasefire. And I also want to echo what is an absolutely uncontroversial appeal to basic humanity and decency. Free Palestine. Free Palestine. So as Dr. Figueroa Velázquez said, 70 years ago today, Lolita Lebrón, Rafael Cancer Miranda, Irving Flores, and Andrés Figueroa Cordero, all members of the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party, opened fire on the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives in an attempt to draw the world's attention to ongoing colonialism in Puerto Rico. They were immediately arrested and jailed. Many years later, in an interview with Iris Morales, who is here with us today, Morales' fellow former young lord, Richie Perez, said that one of the most important moments in his life was being able to hand Lolita Lebron the flag that he and other members of the committee to free the Puerto Rican nationalists had hung from the crown of the Statue of Liberty in October of 1977. Doña Lolita and the other remaining nationalist prisoners were released in 1979, that is 45 years ago this September. 1 month later, I was born in San Juan. A strong memory from my teenage years is of some of the posters that decorated a room used as an office in my grandparents' apartment, which included a small replica of Juan Luis Martínez's political poster, No hay imperio que pueda ahogar el anhelo de libertad, memorializing the Statue of Liberty takeover. The poster had been a gift from my Uncle Pedro, who had been a member of the Puerto Rican Socialist Party here in New York in the early 1970s and was still living in Philadelphia when the takeover took place. Although I never had the honor of meeting Richie Perez, I had the opportunity to be at Liberty Island when the Puerto Rican flag was hung from the statue a second time, along with that of Vieques and 2 large banners on November 5th, 2000 by Alberto de Jesus Mercado, better known as Tito Kayak. Among the crowd of those supporting the planned action that took place that day, along with the group that came from Puerto Rico and those of us who were then recent arrivals to the diaspora, were various former members of the Young Lords, El Comité-Movimiento, and other veterans, as well as younger diaspora activists. Many of you may recognize Vicente Panama Alba in the photo. He's the reason it got published in Centro Journal in the first place. Most of the rest of us in the photo were part of a group that no one else remembers, called Sangre Nueva. And there were many more people there as well, including the late, great plenero Hector Tito Matos, who recently left us way too soon. May he rest in power. Although histories of Puerto Rican radicalism have long been written, The term radical tradition itself has only very recently begun to be used by some activist youth groups here in the diaspora, and to my knowledge, not at all in academia. In conceptualizing today's event, we borrowed the concept from scholars of the Atlantic Black diaspora and the Black radical tradition. In my search for a framework to conceptualize the genealogies of Puerto Rican radicalism as part of my own research on its shifting coordinates since the late 1990s, I have been enormously influenced and inspired by works such as Cedric Robinson's seminal Black Marxism, first published in 1983, where the term Black radical tradition was first articulated theoretically. Robin Kelly's now classic Freedom Dreams, first published in 2002, which explores the Black radical imagination, a concept intimately tied to that of the radical tradition. And more recently, Ruth Wilson Gilmore's Abolition Geography, published in 2022, which emphasizes the retrospective selective process of accumulation of emotion and ideas through which what she calls the infrastructure of feeling of a radical tradition is formed. These works remind us that whatever the origin of certain political languages and discourses, specific struggles are always rooted in particular experiences and collective desires. Thinking of genealogies of radicalism in terms of a radical tradition thus allows us to conceive of experientially rooted political spaces shaped by the accumulation over time of multiple interacting, intersecting, intertwined, and sometimes contradictory and competing currents of political thought and action, or rooted and relational, as we now like to say here at Centro. The Puerto Rican radical tradition has long had an intuition of itself in this sense. During its first few decades, Centro, itself the historical product of struggles at the very heart of this tradition, saw stewardship over this infrastructure, of which it knew itself to be part, as central to its mission. For example, in a little-known article on Puerto Rican studies on the left, published in 1986 as part of a 3-volume series on Marxist scholarship on American campuses, Frank Bonilla, Ricardo Campos, and Juan Flores wrote, in terms that at different points in the text seem to echo Robinson and anticipate Kelly and Gilmore, of national affirmation in revolutionary Puerto Rican culture as playing a selective and critical role based on the needs and dynamics of present-day struggles. And this understanding is obviously palpable in Centro's earlier and later work as well. Beyond the founding members of Centro, a number of authors have attempted to approach Puerto Rican radicalism in similar terms. Perhaps revealingly, however, most of this work has been done in terms of the movements of the diaspora, from a significant number of articles published in the 1990s in Centro Journal, through landmarks such as Iris Morales' 1996 documentary Pa'lante Siempre Pa'lante, and the publication of the Puerto Rican movement in 1998, edited by Andy Torres and Che Velázquez. All three of them, by the way, are here with us today on panel one. All the way to several important recent books and articles, and there are unfortunately too many to list here. This is not to say that there has not been plenty of scholarly writing on the archipelago that has addressed some aspect of these issues. Key among them, of course, is Arcadio Díaz Quiñones' La Memoria Rota from 1993, a collection of essays from the last decade of the 1980s and early 1990s that, while reaching beyond political radicalism, is essentially a tribute to those intellectuals who have contributed to rebuilding or reselecting a critical tradition of thought against colonial forgetting and occupied memory. In the book's titular essay, the author discusses, among others, the political and literary praxis of former Puerto Rican Communist Party leader Cesar Andreu Iglesias as such a work of critical memory that successfully contributed to this long tradition of critical radical thought. While Díaz Quiñones focuses primarily on Andreu's literary work, it is precisely in the political debates between Andreu and activists from the Nationalist Party's orbit starting in the late 1940s, especially Juan Antonio Correger, pictured here receiving his Communist Party card from Andreu, that the contours of what I am calling the Puerto Rican radical tradition began to take visible shape. Correger lasted a little over a year in the CP before being expelled, but he, as well as Andreu, would go on to found other organizations that left an indelible mark within the Puerto Rican radical tradition. As with other radical traditions, My contention is that despite heated disagreement over means or tactics, just as much as over long-term strategy, it is not one or another set of tactics or strategic goals that defines this space as radical, but the debate itself over how best to transform society by grasping at the root, whatever that root is imagined to be. The Puerto Rican radical tradition in this sense is not just independentismo in an abstract sense, but rather the search for an answer to the question posed in the radical 1970s, independencia para qué? For many, the answer to that question was imagined to lie in one version or another of the process of breaking the twin shackles of colonialism and capitalism, which also began to increasingly require re-examinations of race and gender in the radical imagination. Having no single origin, the tradition is not propelled forward through history in a straight line, but rather emerged gradually and circuitously as the result of the difficult encounters between various ideological currents, especially revolutionary nationalism and anarchist and Marxist working class internationalism, with each other and with the popular struggles of the late 19th and especially the early 20th century. Such encounters were often made possible and intensified in and through the shared experiences of migration and diaspora. This emerging space became a movement field within and through which further liberatory movements and organizations could later emerge or take root and flourish, including many, not all, of the communitarian, environmental, feminist, queer, and anti-racist currents of the latter 20th century through the present. The ongoing result, in Puerto Rico's particular coordinates, has been a political space defined at a bare minimum by confrontation with the colonial state on the one hand, and by an expansive attitude towards social justice on the other. The different strands that today form part of this political space have not always coexisted harmoniously. They represent different experiences and desires, mobilize different material, discursive, and effective resources and practices, and have often emerged despite and against each other. To see them as co-constitutive of a radical tradition and shared political space, as I do, is thus both a choice and a wager. I have come to believe, however, that in the long run it is more accurate and fruitful both intellectually and politically, to see them as always, than to see them as always and necessarily at odds. Furthermore, I do not wish to suggest by positing a Puerto Rican radical tradition as a distinct intellectual and political space in its own right, that it is a state entirely separate from the Black or other radical traditions. The Puerto Rican and other Black Atlantic traditions have always existed in intimate, if not always acknowledged, relation and dialogue, intersecting and overlapping often, not just in the lives of specific Afro-Boricua individuals, but also in their repeatedly crisscrossing paths of convergence and solidarity. To give just two examples, we can mention Denise Oliver's crucial presence in the leadership of the Young Lords, or the work of Dr. Ana Livia Cordero, whose life and work have been studied in depth by Dr. Sandy Placido, who is also here with us today. Despite the abundance of work from different disciplines on the most visible organizations and currents of Puerto Rican radicalism, a number of critical gaps remain. Some of these reflect hierarchical erasures reproduced within the tradition itself. Others, the vicissitudes of clandestinity and armed struggle, or ideological conflicts within the tradition itself as filtered with inevitable distortions through academia. Some of these gaps could begin to be closed through the more holistic approach that I am proposing. My own research, for example, seeks to address the relative absence of in-depth studies on Puerto Rican political radicalism from the late 1990s to the present by interweaving activist biographies and their narratives of key events to reveal a dynamic movement field that, despite shifts and ruptures typical of any evolving movement, remains firmly and self-consciously rooted in the radical tradition. Whatever the historical period or geographic location, a major implication and challenge of examining a radical tradition as such is to frankly and openly approach our radical intellectuals, including such figures as Jesús Colón, pictured here, with his running mate in the 1969 New York City mayoral election, or commander of the Puerto Rican Socialist League, Consuelo Lee Tapia, pictured on the right, alongside her much better known husband, and that's Don Rafa Cansan Miranda behind them. Not just as generic community leaders or literary figures, but as what Antonio Gramsci called organic intellectuals, activists committed to organizing and bringing to fruition specific radical political projects. While much has already been lost to time, erasures, and bad archival practices, much remains untapped and scattered in a few crucial archives and private collections. Too much remains precariously preserved in ephemeral spaces and in the memories of those who lived through key moments. As with every previous generation, as young activists and scholars gain a renewed interest in radical politics on their own terms in the archipelago as well as the diaspora, the work of selecting, interpreting, and communicating the radical tradition also acquires a renewed relevance. Fortunately, beyond established archives like the wonderful one that we have here at Centro, there are also new efforts to preserve and make accessible material, printed and otherwise, that would otherwise soon be lost forever. I want to quickly highlight two. Although their focus is largely on archipelago groups, there's tons of material relevant to the diaspora as well. The activist-run Proyecto Coave at coave.org has scanned and made it accessible online dozens of previously difficult to find publications and documents from the radical organizations of the 1960s through 1980s. And Colección Gilberto Arias González, or Colección GAG on Instagram, is a treasure trove of political posters from the creation of radical artists to organizational propaganda ephemera that have been the subject of various important recent exhibitions. In any case, many gaps remain. My hope is that the conversation with our excellent panelists today will stimulate those of us already working to fill them and encourage others to join us. Today's event is the result of long and ongoing conversations with many people, some of whom are here today. We have attempted to put together these panels in a way that reflects important aspects of this tradition. Our first panel, Nuyorican Socialists in the 1970s, explores a defining moment in the Puerto Rican radical tradition that took shape right here in New York by bringing together author activists from the city's three major Puerto Rican radical organizations of the 1970s, all three of which adopted socialist ideas and solidarity with other revolutionary movements across the world as central elements of their platforms. Our second panel, A Radical Archive, introduces us to little-known but crucial figures and organizations and highlights important archival and historiographic questions that are raised by the cumulative, retroactive, and continually reselective character of the tradition, including the ever-present issue of power hierarchies and historical erasures, the vulnerability of material archives, and what genuinely radical archival practices might look like. Our third panel examines the past, present, and futures of the Puerto Rican radical imagination through a conversation on the role of art and placemaking between longtime activists and residents of the Lower East Side, Loisaida, and Santurce, Puerto Rico. May this be the first of many events and projects that brings together activists and scholars from across a wide range of disciplines and practices to think through the rich and complex political space that is the Puerto Rican radical tradition. And without further ado, and I'll leave you with the moderator of panel one, who will introduce the panelists, my friend, compañero de muchas luchas, and colleague, Saulo Colón Zavala, is probably my closest co-conspirator on this project and deserves credit as a co-organizer of the event. Saulo was born into the Boricua left, in other words, into the Puerto Rican radical tradition, is second-generation diaspora-Rican, proud of his GED, and teaches at community colleges and prisons in Connecticut, including Housatonic Community College, where he's associate professor of sociology. Throughout his life, he has been active in various Puerto Rican organizations and movements, including most recently, Puerto Rico is Not for Sale. Saulo?
So I really want to get to the discussion. We have four people that I want to introduce, and then interview them. They're sitting in the front row. I know we have a lot of folks that are watching us, but it's great to see all of you here as well. One note that I want to say, one of the panelists couldn't make it. She's the author of the book on el Comité-Movimiento, Pros Mucio, and so she also recommended the person who wrote the prologue, Quintana, sitting here, to speak about that experience as well. So just wanted to put that out there. Let me give you the biographies, and as I do so, the people that I'm speaking about will come to the stage, and then we have a set of questions to open up the discussion, and then we'll have Q&A. Hopefully a substantial amount of time so that folks in the audience can participate, and then we'll have some final thoughts from them based on the questions asked. So empezando con Iris Morales. Iris is a lifelong political activist, educator, feminist, and author of Revisiting Her Stories, the Young Lord's Party, and Through the Eyes of Rebel Women. and many of us know her through Palante. For over 50 years, she has been active with movements advocating for racial, gender, and social justice and the decolonization of Puerto Rico. I'm going to add, and socialism, because Edith will tell you that. Edith was a leading member of the Young Lords Party, co-founder of the Women's Caucus and Women's Union, and served as a co-leader in the Philadelphia chapter. She is the producer of the film Palante Siempre Palante, documenting these experiences. Presently, Edith is the founding director of Red Sugarcane Press, producing projects about the Puerto Rican experience in the Americas. She has a GED from NYU Law School and an MFA in Integrated Media Arts. Andrés Torres, Andy Torres, was born in the South Bronx and raised in Washington Heights. Since his youth, he has participated in Puerto Rican and Latino political organizing, including the Puerto Rican Socialist Party, and in movements for social change, racial, and economic justice. Among his publications are Between Melting Pot and Mosaic, the Puerto Rican Movement, Voices from the Diaspora, Signing in Puerto Rican, which is biographical if you don't know, and Revolution Around the Corner, which is the most recent edition book that looks at the PSP experience. He has authored journal articles on labor force change, migration patterns, urban demographic change, workforce development, public policy, and social movements. Now retired, he was on the faculty at the University of Massachusetts in Boston and at Lehman College here at CUNY. Andy.
Yeah, baby.
Well, I see una cosa, because when you read the bios of stuff, you're like, I can tell someone wrote this, like for a certain kind of setting, because when you know the people themselves, you're like, hay otras cosas that I would say, right? Posiblemente cosas that matter more to them. But anyway, I guess I'm just going to read what was given to me. And those folks who are being spoken about will forgive me. José Velázquez, we call him Che Velázquez. Born in Santurce, Puerto Rico, Velázquez was raised in Harlem until moving to Newark in 1979. He obtained a BA in American History at Columbia University and his MD at Montclair State University. He is a retired Newark Public Schools social studies teacher, curriculum writer, and founder of the Thurgood Marshall Law Academy. Known in the movement as Che, he joined the PSP in 1972, becoming the circulation manager of Claridad Bilingüe, Secretary of Student Affairs, and Secretary of the party in New York in 1975, before resigning from the PSP in 1983. If you want to know why, that'll be part of the discussion today. His opposition to the war in Vietnam led to his arrest, trial, and conviction in USA versus Velázquez, in a seminal case that went all the way to the Supreme Court. He is co-editor of 2 books on Puerto Rican radical history with Andy and Carmen Vivian, who's also here, The Puerto Rican Movement in 1998 and Revolution Around the Corner in 2022.
Yeah, baby.
And just to make sure, I wanted to say, Carmen Vivian Rivera is one of the co-authors also on this book, and she's also here present and hopefully will participate from the audience.
Yeah, baby.
Víctor Quintana was a member of the Comité-Movimiento de Izquierda Nacional Puertorriqueño from 1973 to 1981. During his membership, Victor served on the Central Committee and Political Commission of the organization. From 1990 to 1994, he served in the mayoral administration of David Dinkins, first as Director of Constituency Services in the Mayor's Office, and later as the Chief of Staff to the Commissioner of the Department of Environmental Protection. From 1997 to 2014, Victor served as a Senior Program Officer and later as Deputy Director of the Unitarian Universalist Beach Program at Shelter, a faith-based grant-making program where he focused on supporting community and workplace organizing. After retiring from the program, Victor served for 8 years on the board of the New York Foundation, which supports community organizing and social and economic justice movement building. So, para empezar, I introduced them. Many of you know folks have long histories and a lot to say. And so this is very exciting to be able to invite them here. There was a similar program that was done at People's Forum. And so we see ourselves as trying to also continue that conversation. And they themselves have talked about things that they didn't get a chance to get into then. And so hopefully we came up with these questions together. And it took a while, because if you've ever been in a room with these folks, eso no es fácil. Right? So we agreed on 4 questions, many iterations. And so this is something that we definitely thought about and are bringing, and hopefully going to have a full conversation here with all of you. So let's begin. We have a series of questions, and then we want to make sure we get to the Q&A, and then I have time to wrap up. So the first question, I'm going to ask, it's a question for each one, but I will repeat it over again. So this is for all of you, right? So we'll start with Victor at the end and move this way. Victor, why did you become a socialist, and why did you choose the group that you joined?
Okay, well, let me start from, again, my origins. I was born in Juncos, Puerto Rico in 1948. My family moved to New York City in July 1950. My family, we were all rural migrants because we were from a rural part of Puerto Rico. I grew up in East and West Harlem and lived in tenements and public housing. In 1967, after my freshman year, I dropped out of Hunter College and enlisted for 2 years in the Marine Corps. I will never forget my arrival at Paris Island, the Marine Corps Recruit Training Center. A sergeant with a Southern drawl greeted us, and we were a group of Nuyoricans. And he said to us, "You spics and niggers, get off my bus." In the training before I was sent to Vietnam, all I heard was about the goops. Little distinction was made between those Vietnamese people who we were sent to defend and those who we were supposed to be defeating. In the fall of 1969, I returned to college. It was no longer Hunter College, it was Lehman College. The demographics of the college had dramatically changed. There was a large number of Black and Latino students because of open admissions and other programs. There was a Puerto Rican Studies department and a Black Studies department, and there was a politicized student body. In the spring of 1970, students rallied on campus to oppose the United States invasion of Cambodia and the killing of student opponents to the invasion at Kent State and Jackson State. I supported these rallies. I enrolled in classes offered by the Puerto Rican Studies Department, specifically classes on Puerto Rican history. I learned about the Puerto Rican colonial history. And I became involved with the Puerto Rican Student Union, a CUNY-wide activist network, which opposed the Vietnam War and advocated for the independence of Puerto Rico. I became a student activist and worked with other students, Puerto Rican and Latino students, to form a Latino organization on campus. In 1971, I moved to the South Bronx to live in the same building as a college friend. Then the South Bronx, the tenements in the borough were being torched by landlords to obtain insurance payments. This friend introduced me to El Comité, then an Upper West Side community group fighting for housing and education rights, which supported independence for Puerto Rico. In 1972, I started working with El Comité, participating in events, attending actions, and participating in political education. In 1973, I decided I should become a member. I was taken by the diversity of the organization in age and backgrounds, the commitment of the members, and impressed by how the members treated each other. It was clear that you were judged not by what you said or by who you were, but by what you did. I became a socialist when in 1975, the organization decided to have a formative assembly and declare itself as a Marxist-Leninist organization committed to revolution in this country and to the independence of Puerto Rico. Now, many of the people that I started with in Comité-Movimiento are some of my best friends and comrades. So that's my story. It was, obviously there's a lot of detail in this narrative, but we're not here to go into all those details. I just wanted to give you a framework of the realities that got me to become a student activist, a radical, and hopefully I became a revolutionary.
Gracias, Victor. Before I ask Chair the question, I can see everybody's face, right? So we have this amazing slides behind us. It's going to be going constantly through the session, and it'll repeat at some point in time. And so we're going to refer to events and things. It was put together by José and the staff here, and purposely to try to show some of the key things that occurred. And you'll see some of them in those pictures. So if you miss something, just wait; it'll come back around. Hey, Jay, we had this discussion earlier, but why did you become a socialist, and why specifically choose the PSP?
Well, I was a socialist before I became a member of the PSP. And this is what I think distinguishes the Puerto Rican radical tradition of the 60s upward from the previous Puerto Rican radical tradition, because that radical tradition stems all the way from the struggle against colonialism in Spain to the early 19th century, 20th century radical traditions. But in the 60s, the Nuyorican or diaspora-Rican, whatever you want to call it, tradition becomes an important element of the Puerto Rican independence and socialist movements. Many of us came from different political radical traditions. The women's movement, the war against, the struggle against the war in Vietnam, Black liberation, Chicano liberation. So we had already been active in those organizations, radical traditions. I came from the Black liberation movement. At 13, I was a member of SNCC Youth Congress. And in the East River Projects here in East Harlem, not that far away, it was easy to go from SNCC to the Black Panthers because there was an informal alliance at one time between SNCC and the Black Panthers. So when I was in high school, we formed the first Black Panther Party high school coalition, and we had a storefront, 602 Columbus Avenue, right near where the Comité had its offices, and we became the first chapter of the Black Panther Party in Manhattan. I was Black before I was Puerto Rican. But people, understand what I mean. I'm talking about social consciousness. In my family, Black consciousness for us, my brothers and sisters, was more important than Puerto Rican consciousness. When I became a member of the PSP, I had never even been to Puerto Rico. I went to Puerto Rico when I was 21 years old. I had already been a member of the PSP for 3 years. I went to Cuba before I went to Puerto Rico. So the next big step for me was meeting Iris Morales and Felipe Luciano and others, and we met on 104th Street in the Gut Theater to form the Gut Theater, which later became the Third World Revelationist here in El Barrio, a guerrilla theater political organization which had a strong presence in El Barrio and throughout the U.S. was for those of you who go way back, understood the importance of the Third World Revelationists on college campuses. So when the Third World Revelationists decided to dissolve, I looked at what organization would I become a member of. I had major differences with the militaristic wing of the Black Panthers. I was in the Serve the People wing. not in the Black Liberation Army wing. And I looked at the Young Lords, but the Young Lords were too similar to the Black Panthers for me to become a member of. So right across the street was NPI, PSP becoming the Puerto Rican Socialist Party. And then I saw a lot of young people, young Ricans, becoming a member of that organization. And so then that's when I made the transition to become a member of the PSP in 1972. And I was there for about 11 years.
Gracias, Che. Iris, you want to take that question?
Yes. Well, first of all, I want to say thank you to Dr. Figueroa and to the Centro staff. I know they put in a lot of work. And to José for putting this conversation together, and Saulo, you for directing it. And then I also want to say Free Palestine.
Free Palestine.
Like my comrades here, I'm very happy to be here because we go back decades. I knew Che when he was a teenager. And we worked at the Gut Theater, and basically we did street theater. So we didn't separate culture and politics. My beginning as a socialist is a long story, but I will give you the short 5-minute version. I always say that I was influenced by my experience with poverty and the social movements of the day, especially the Black Liberation Movement and the movement against the war in Vietnam. So those were two big influences on my political development. My family came from Puerto Rico, from rural areas in Puerto Rico in the late 40s. My father worked as an elevator operator, and my mom was a garment worker. So I grew up in a Spanish-speaking working class family, hearing stories about bosses and injustices in the workplace from very young. I was the translator for my mom. So I went to the Social Security office. I was the oldest of 4 girls. So me tocó a mí, to be the one to take mommy everywhere. She had a 3rd grade education. She never learned English. So I had that job for a long time, many decades. But in the course of that, I saw how, whether I was at the Social Security office or the hospital or a school, how Puerto Ricans and African Americans were treated with disdain, with disrespect, with disgust. And that also started shaping the way I was looking at the world, from very young. So by the time that I was in high school, I started organizing con lo vecino in my building, for better housing conditions, and then found that a local organization that was doing housing work, and they actually trained me as a tenant organizer. So I was officially trained. And I found that I loved organizing. I loved being in the neighborhood, talking to people, knocking on doors, us making trouble together, organizing rent strikes. I loved it. So I said, this is for me, So when I entered City College, I was looking to get involved in another organization. There were no Puerto Rican organizations at the time. And so I joined Onyx because so much of our growing up at that time was Black or white. So you had to decide you're going Black or white. I always went with African American because that's where I felt my affinity despite my skin color. But that's how I never identified white. So this white presenting thing is distressing to me because I never saw that, recognizing white privilege though. But in any event, so I joined the Onyx and then worked with other Puerto Rican students to form the first Puerto Rican student organization at City College, PRISA, Puerto Ricans Involved in Student Action. Then from there, while I was at City, I had the opportunity to visit Cuba with a group of students from the United States, the first group of US students to visit Cuba after the revolution. And we went to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the Cuban Revolution. So I had to take a semester off, where I wound up 3 months immersed in socialism, socialist ideas, and socialist practices. When I returned, City College was at the height of the takeover, the 1969 takeover, which established Black and Puerto Rican studies and open admissions. And shortly after that, I went to the youth conference, the Denver Youth Conference, Chicanos Youth Conference, with a busload of us, Nuyorican and African Americans. We went to the youth conference there to support. It was a big gathering of La Raza. And there I met Chacha Jimenez and the Young Lords. And I really liked their direct action ideas and community work. So when I returned to New York, the group was forming, the Young Lords were forming, and I decided to join. I was drawn by the socialist, nationalist, direct action philosophy, and the Comité didn't exist yet, and PSP didn't exist yet. So MPI, I had attended a few meetings of the Movimiento Pro Independencia on 14th Street. The meetings were in Spanish, and they were primarily focused on organizing for the independence of Puerto Rico. And I was very interested in organizing for self-determination of Puerto Ricans in the United States as well. And so I joined the Young Lords. I felt that's where I wanted to be. I could be in the community, knocking on doors, making trouble, and I like that.
That's it. Andy, same question. Why did you become a socialist and why the PSP?
Repeating earlier senses of gratitude, thanks to everybody here at Centro, to the organizers of this panel. Well, I'll start my story in my late teens or so. I grew up in Washington Heights. That was like a rural province of New York City, pre-Dominican era, so very diverse, white, ethnic, Greeks, Italians, Jews, and a fairly significant Puerto Rican enclave as well. I was a gung-ho Americano when I was about 17 or 18, and I attended a Catholic college, Manhattan College. My parents were deaf, sordos. So my culture, so to speak, was growing up in a deaf Puerto Rican family. We had several cousins, aunts and uncles who were, this was our language, this was our culture, sign. So in a way, we were cut off from the hearing world, even of the Puerto Rican community, even though I had several hearing Puerto Rican relatives. But that's my immediate context. And from there, in my late 70s, late teens, late 70s now, we went through a period very chaotic for me, very contradictory, a lot of confusion even about my identity, and a series of rapid changes in my life, my personal biography, which included getting married very young, having a daughter at a very early age. My daughter then was less than a year old. She is now a woman of a certain age. And Rachel right over here. next to my son, Orlando, who came a little later. Anyway, that route to socialism was winding and up and down, and certainly not a linear process. But it involved all sorts of changes in who I thought I was, in my beliefs. I had this capacity to have my brain a home for contradictory ideas and perspectives, which cause a lot of stress and tension as well. Everything from religion to the society around me. Why were my parents having such a tough go? They were working class Puerto Ricans. My father in the garment center, my mother worked in a firecracker factory in Brooklyn, and all of that. Not unusual for the deaf community and the Puerto Rican deaf community. In a way that I learned to identify injustices in society, because nobody gave a rat's ass about the deaf, leave alone the Puerto Rican deaf. So that presented a lot of questions for me, even about, from Puerto Rican, because I didn't see too many Puerto Ricans caring about the Puerto Rican deaf tampoco. So how does one go from that sort of origin story into a thing as tight and defined as socialismo in Puerto Rico, which I knew nothing about until I was in my early 20s. But sure enough, you get hit in school, in college, and so forth with the society that we had at the time. You had to have lived through the late 60s to understand what was going on, at that time. It was one thing after another, from Malcolm X, who I did not know anything about, all the way through Vietnam, Martin Luther King, the Black liberation, civil rights, Black power, da. And out of that, I went on a search that ultimately defined my own identity as a Puerto Rican. I suppressed the fact of my deaf culture because people just didn't get it, what it was, what it meant to have deaf parents. And to go through explaining that every time to teachers, to friends and all of that, except for my very close friends around the block, which was Puertorriqueño, 177th Street and Amsterdam Avenue. But from there to the link to the political movements, the place where it all happened really was through the student movement, Lucha, which was a group that we formed. There, I got connected to the Carlos Feliciano Defense Committee. We had a collective called Puerto Ricans for Self-Determination, as there were many such collectives at the time. And so one thing led to another, and some of us went on a search for how best to apply our anger and our sense of injustice to the Puerto Rican case, which also came to the forefront in terms of identity, because that was a hot thing at the time. There was profile around the Puerto Rican movement and El Caso de Puerto Rico. And eventually, after searching around, I looked at different organizations. I was not familiar with El Comité. Maybe if I had grown up in the lower West Side in the 80s and so forth, I would have been a member of El Comité. This is how these things happen. The Young Lords, when I checked them out, I had some friends, people that I knew that were connected to them. I just felt that at the time, MPI, which I knew was transitioning into a PSP and a socialist ideology, that attracted to me because of their commitment to wanting to organize in the diaspora around las condiciones puertorriqueñas in Estados Unidos. I felt that MPI, PSP at the moment was a better, had a good cross-sectional representation of our community at the time that appealed to me. I knew other people who were going into MPI at the time as well. So from there, I joined in '71, the summer of '71, and was there in the PSP until 1983, when a group of us basically withdrew from the PSP before its third Congress in 1983. And we had a wonderful camaraderie among people that to this day we are close. Those who stayed, those who left, and many left and many came in over that period that we were there. And for years after, we kept on doing work. And maybe later we can talk about the reasons for that rupture.
Okay, thank you. So let's get into some of the really good questions. But for those who didn't know, we wanted to make sure you had an intro to who these folks are. These questions are going to be specifically for certain people, and there's a reason for that because as you know now, Che and Andy were both in the same organization, so some of these questions are about the organization itself, not about the personal experience. So we're going to start with Andy. Since there were political differences between your organizations, can you explain how your organization understood its role and tasks in regards to the island as well as the local community issues? In addition, how did this analysis impact your relationship with the other organizations, groups from the island, and then other sectors of the left?
3 minutes, right? I think I'm only going to do the first part to be, useful, and then hopefully in the question and answer we can talk about how I or Che. And by the way, Che and I are going to split the questions. We're not each going to answer all the questions. It would be unfair to have our organization, double opportunity. So, what was the perception that we had in SFA regarding our role? We have what we call at one point it was actually called a dual priority. So we were living with that ambiguity and tension from the beginning. We set out to, in the transition from the MPI to the PSP, the branch in the United States took on the commitment to not only darle apoyo, to give their support through solidarity efforts and so forth, to the struggle for liberation of Puerto Rico, independence, but also to organize seriously, which it had not done in the stage of MPI, the PSP around conditions of the community here, using socialism as the frame, using socialist ideology as a frame. Basically, society's needs are to be privileged over the economy's needs, people's needs over profit making. Very basic conception of socialism, but we added the layer of Marxism to it, and Marxism-Leninism, which essentially, followed Marxist conception of how capitalist societies were organized, why working people, poor people, and so forth were put in an inferior, vulnerable position because of the way capitalism operates. And also where the imperialism comes in through Lenin, the idea of going beyond just how one country organizes itself, capitalism, to saying capitalist countries, especially the United States, needs to look beyond its own boundaries to survive. Capitalism cannot survive, and this is Marx, without growing and greedily expanding because we needed the natural resources, we needed the control over other labor forces beyond the US capitalist system. So those simple, basic ideas were very powerful and very useful to organizing something as detailed and as concrete as the Puerto Rican community, right? One of the most depressed and vulnerable and exploited communities within the United States. The statistics told us that. Our own individual lives told us that. Now, we didn't believe that it was a narrow organization, only Puertorriqueños, only Puerto Rican issues. That's not socialism either. It's about seeing the big picture, going to the roots of the problem, and organizing, therefore, with other peoples, with other sectors of the US working class. But now here we were, an admittedly smaller organization, only one piece of a national organization in Puerto Rico. We were organically connected with the PSP in La Isla. And so we took on a very ambitious role. It was from the beginning very unsustainable. But you know what? For a bunch of years, throughout the 70s, that idea of integrating both allá y acá with a socialist frame was an enormous power to us in gathering, educating, and the mobilization that enabled in us, as opposed to if the vision had just been, we're only going to organize in the US, or we're only going to organize around what's happening in Puerto Rico. At least at that moment, we believed we were using that formula in a way that could develop our movement.
Gracias.
Very good, very good.
Gracias, Che.
We're going to get there.
So, and that's a great place to leave off because Edith has something to say about that dual.
Well, I want to pick up exactly where you left, which is the dual commitment. Because in the Young Lords, we also had that dual commitment from the beginning. And what distinguished us, I guess, at that point was where the emphasis was. And for the Young Lords, we went through 3 phases. Now, our focus from the beginning was on the conditions of Puerto Ricans in the United States, with developing consciousness and mobilizing to support the independence struggle in Puerto Rico. So we had a 13-point program, and our first point said exactly that: self-determination for Puerto Ricans in the United States and the independence of Puerto Rico. So of course there's an inherent tension in that, in addition to it being a big task. But we have to see what the contribution was, because at that moment, what was happening in the Puerto Rican community was disaster poverty for Puerto Ricans, and poverty pimps. So that was the situation. And then there was some, organizations that were developing to try and issue-oriented organizations that were trying to develop, to better the Puerto Rican community, but there wasn't anything radical. So that was a very big contribution for young people, and we're all talking about young people in our 20s, late teens, 20s, to declare socialism. We were also all influenced by what was happening in the United States as a whole. In the Young Lords in particular, our alliance was with the Black Panther Party. So from the very beginning, we had that alliance, and the Black Panther Party had, coming from its own radical tradition. And why? Well, there are a lot of reasons why we were close to the Black Panther Party. We had, as I said, there was either black or white, and you had to decide where you felt you were tied to in terms of your oppression, and we were living. It's not like, it's like Andy said, we lived in communities. It wasn't like It's just the Puerto Ricans. Your neighbor might be African American. The schools you went to, so you had that kind of affinity. There was much less of that kind of integration in our communities in terms of, let's say, white Americans. So that was one reason, the objective reality. The other reason was that we had a majority leadership of Afro-Boricuas. And so we had an affinity for understanding the history of Blackness and Black oppression in this country. The other reason is that 20% of our membership was African American. And why was 20% of our membership African American? For whatever reason, people didn't feel an affinity to join the Panther Party, but they felt that the Young Lords, they could join the Young Lords because we were fighting for the same socialist values and social issues in the community. So that was another important reason. So in terms of Puerto Rico, it became part of, as Andy had said, we were learning Puerto Rican history. You know, I knew Malcolm X and I knew Black history before I knew anything about Puerto Rican history, even though I traveled to Puerto Rico with my family and got to see rural poverty. I mean, you know, my cousins that had one pair of shoes that they would take off when they got home from school, you know, so I had a sense of a global sense of what poverty might look like in other places. So we organized in three stages. In the first stage of the Young Lords, we organized in communities and had a lot of success. We didn't do socialism for dummies. There's one picture there, I think, where we had socialism in a park and we're distributing clothing. So, you know, the community knew we were socialists. And what did socialism mean? Socialism meant that capitalism is a declining system. I would say that's, you know, community events. Capitalism is a declining system. You know, it will never meet the needs of poor people because it's about making money. You know, so in a way to organize with people, we put out our socialist ideas from the beginning. And so that was the first phase, that we were able to organize the community. And also, if you look at Palante, we saw the importance of having a newspaper. From the beginning, we had, you know, articles about Puerto Rican history. We had demonstrations. It was integrated into whenever we spoke, it was there. In the second period then, and I know my time is breaking, so and this will leave it for later. In the second period, the Young Lords decided to prioritize Puerto Rico. Close the offices in New York, open 2 offices in Puerto Rico, send Puerto Ricans, Nuyorican, who some didn't even speak Spanish, to go organize in Puerto Rico, and it was a fiasco. And then there was the third period, which when the Young Lords closed the Puerto Rico project, that was called the Party Building Motion, which we can get into it, which was a commitment to develop the working class party in the United States, which hard to talk about, but anyway. So those are the 3 stages, and that's how we came, how we put out our socialist ideas and commitment to Puerto Rico.
Gracias. So that's a great place to end it, because Victor can also talk about the Comité-Movimiento, because they, different from the PSP, also inserted themselves into that broader American left. And so maybe that's for the second question. How did your organization understand its role and tasks, and specifically, how did that analysis impact your work with Puerto Rican groups, the island, and the other sectors of the left?
Well, picking up from where Edie's left off in terms of stages, and not to go into a long history of the Comité, but there were basically 3 big stages in the Comité. One was 1970 to 1973, 73 to 75, and 75 till the demise of the organization in the early 80s. In the first phase, the 70 to 73 phase, the Comité was born out of the struggle of local community people in the Upper West Side struggling to stay in their homes. because the city was gentrifying the neighborhood. And so they were emptying out tenements, particularly people where the landlords had not been paying their taxes, and the city took over those properties. And they were evicting the tenants from those buildings. All of those people were poor people, Puerto Ricans, but Dominicans, African Americans. Those were the people who populated those buildings. And we're talking about from around 186th Street to 95th Street, from 86th to 95th Street, from Broadway to Central Park West. That's where those tenements were. So, this is the period where Comité was deeply involved in its community roots, fighting to get the city to stop the evictions and to rehabilitate the buildings that they were scheduling to tear down to build middle-income housing. Out of those struggles, the Comité moved on to another neighborhood issue, which was around education, particularly around bilingual education. So many of the kids of these families were bilingual, were English dominant, Spanish dominant, and the schools were not prepared to serve their needs because they predominantly were speaking Spanish in their home. Plus, as a value, the people in Comité said it's important for people to speak Spanish. In fact, Spanish should be spoken by everybody, not just English. So, that first period was about those roots. In 1973, the organization decided to review what it had been done for the past 3 years. And it said, we got to become more political, because we were influenced by the fact that there was the Young Lords, and there was the Movimiento Pro Independencia, the predecessor to the Puerto Rican Socialist Party. So we had the people in the Comité had become independentistas during that period of 1970 to 1973 because of the influences of these other organizations. So, and the way individuals play a role is that there was an individual by the name of Americo Badillo, who was a transplant from Puerto Rico. He was a professor at Fordham University in the downtown Manhattan campus, and he became a tutor and a friend to members of a comité who were attending his classes. And so he, heard about what a comité was doing, and he offered his services to come and teach us Puerto Rican history. So that's where the introduction of most of the people in the comité took place in terms of independence. But a lot of them already heard it, and maybe some of them had attended meetings of the MPI or activities of the Young Lords. But really, when Americo Badillo came into the organization and offered his skills and his knowledge, that it took a different turn. Now, Americo was an unusual person. He had been trained as a Jesuit, and a Jesuit liberation project. So he was not only aware of the history of Puerto Rico, but he was also had been introduced to socialist ideas through the Jesuits. And he had been a member of the Puerto Rican Independence Party when he was in Puerto Rico. So he was a politicized person. So he brought his whole person into the organization. And he had a transformative effect on the organization by the kind of person he was. He was not a working class background. He was from a middle class family in Puerto Rico, but his origins were not what his consciousness was, what his values were. He was committed to working people, and he saw the people in the comité as the kind of working people he wanted to work with. So that's that first phase. And after, when the decision was made in 1973 to do two things. One, to suspend the publication of a newspaper that the organization had called Unidad Latina. So we made that decision to end the publication of Unidad Latina, which is a more a newspaper that focused on issues of the Latin America and also on community issues. So that was suspended, and we decided I wasn't a full member then, but I was in the ranks of the organization. So the decision was made to begin to go into a more rigorous political education process. And to make a long story short, we began to study Marxism-Leninism. We read the classics of Marx and then Lenin, and we also read the writings and the work of Latin American revolutionaries. And I brought an example of one of the books that we read. It was by an intellectual educator and revolutionary from Chile. And her name was Marta Hanica. Some of you might have heard of her. And the book that we studied was Los Conceptos Elementales del Materialismo Histórico. So we went to the roots because Hanica starts with how do societies survive? How do they provide for their people? So it goes through the stages, of how production takes place, and then how over many centuries, human beings transform from one mode of production to another. And she uses Marxist concepts to introduce you to how a society functions and how not just the production of the needs that we have, but also who has the power, how is the ideology or the thinking of society informed by how the social classes relate to how the society provides for itself. So since I need to be succinct, I'll just say that we decided, having begun to use Marxist concepts, to look at the migration of Puerto Ricans. And we looked at that process and we decided that Puerto Ricans, once they migrated here, were integrating into the working class of this country with all its strengths and weaknesses, with all its challenges and potential. So we wrote a document where we outlined this process and made a determination using, an analysis of that migration and the reality here that Puerto Ricans were this dual factor. They were here because of colonialism and imperialism, but once they were here, they were part of the American working class. And so we determined in the stage where I talked about 1975, when we had gone through this process of examination and analysis, that we were going to be Marxist-Leninists and that we were going to be committed to supporting the independence of Puerto Rico, understanding our dual responsibility. One of being as Puerto Ricans coming from the colony to support that liberation struggle, but also as part of the working class here, to have a commitment to develop the revolutionary process in this country with other Marxist-Leninists and other revolutionaries.
Very good. So hopefully that has created, or you already have, some questions, right? So we have some more, but because time, we want to open it up to the audience for Q&A, and I understand that there are already some questions from the online folks. So Kimberly, are you going to read those?
Yes.
Okay.
I wonder if anyone is able to speak to what the Socialist and Nationalist Party is doing now. Are they able to speak to specific work and/or outcomes that have manifested here in the diaspora or in Puerto Rico?
So the Socialist and Nationalist Party, what are they doing now? Right. Should we take, how many questions? Maybe take one more?
The other one is advice, stories, or wisdom for Gen Z youth navigating the process of building global solidarity around self-determination.
These are heavy questions.
The translation for the second one from Gen Z youth. So we're the Nationalists and the Socialist Party now. And Kimberly, can you maybe repeat the second question?
Advice, wisdom, etc. for Gen Z youth that is trying to navigate the process of building global solidarity around self-determination.
And that is actually one of the questions that we had, that maybe we'll come back to because we want to leave with some lessons. And so maybe that question will actually sync up with the lessons. So the Nationalist Party, this formative organization, the PSP, right, another key organization, where are they now? What did they merge into? And what do those political projects look like in Puerto Rico and in diaspora today, as far as you guys can tell us?
I think it's important for the audience to understand that Lenin wrote an article once called "Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder." To a certain degree, all of us were right. The PSP was a mixture of old nationalists who adopted Marxism, Leninism reluctantly, Marxists, Stalinists, Trotskyists, people with Gramsci, Kim Il-sung, because at one time we were all distributing the Kim Il-sung books, for the socialist monarchy, and talking about, Juche and all that. So there was a germ internal. There was so much internal struggle. And the other last thing I think is important for the audience, Vivian came up with the title for our new book called Revolution Around the Corner. And people say, "Why? You thought the revolution was around the corner?" Yeah. That was the predominant ideology, that the revolution was around the corner. And so therefore, we didn't have to talk about the women's movement because we were going to take care of that during socialism. We didn't have to talk about racism because socialism will take care of that. We were preparing for a guerrilla insurgency, an armed insurgency. And that all came to a halt when the PSP participated in the elections in 1976. And then realized it didn't have the support it thought it had. And the irony is that it had support, but because our heads were that the revolution was around the corner, there was no need to build democratic struggles in the U.S. because the Puerto Ricans in the U.S., we were going to make independence, all go back to Puerto Rico, se resolvió el problema. So that was the dominant ultra-left ideology that guided the PSP, and I would say the movement in general. The second thing is that the PSP became the leader of the leftist movement in the U.S. It became at the heart of all the major coalitions. The Madison Square Garden, which moved 20,000 people to Madison Square Garden. 1976 bicentennial without college. Alliances with the Black Panther Party, with white groups. So now the PSP in the U.S. was also in the head of a major leftist movement in the country. That scared actually the leadership in Puerto Rico, because many of them felt that we were deviating, because the revolution is around the corner, you see? Independence is around the corner. So that, I think, was one of the last thing, centralism. There was no democratic centralism in our organizations. There was centralism and censorship and repression of opposing ideas. I was one of those that suffered from a lot of that because I had differences with the party. That's why we left in '83. There was no democratic centralism. There was Stalinist centralism. And that was a major error.
And let's see what Edith has to say about this.
I want to point out that, yes, we all thought revolution around the corner. As a matter of fact, we all didn't think that we would make it to 30 years old. We had this saying that you couldn't trust anybody over 30, right? Because, there were differences between the PSP and the Young Lords. I mean, when Che says central the PSP became central, that was at another point in time. It was part of the continuum because in '69, in terms of the Puerto Rican experience, the Young Lords were at the center. And then because of the mistakes that the Young Lords made by 1975, you had, fortunately, we had after the downfall of the Young Lords, fortunately, there were other organizations that continued organizing in the community. And some of the mistakes of the Young Lords were replicated. But I just wanted for people to have a sense of the continuum of this because our movement went from '69 to when did you end when do you date the ending of El Comité or MIM?
Officially 1983,
Okay,
but actually around 1981.
okay,
The PSP 1993,
okay.
95.
So we had a long period of time to look at. And some of these, and because so often the analysis that is made is of individual organizations or of individuals. And I think for us to understand how we build movements and how movements make mistakes, because we can have within a mass movement that's socialist a difference of ideas. And I do want to say something that's a different perspective that I had, because I was also in the opposition a lot, which meant that, when Chet talks about centralism, yes, the organizations were centralist, but the Young Lords didn't start out centralist. It became centralist. And I think that's important for people to know that you can have organizations that start out democratic and have, and our democracy came from the community because we were community organizers. So people in the community would say, no, si eso no sirve, no, that doesn't work. And then we'd come back into our meetings and talk about, pero el pueblo dice que eso no, so we would have debate, we had democracy with the people. But at a certain point, around '71, a Central Committee faction took over and imposed centralism. And if you oppose the Central Committee, you could be accused of being an agent, which was the worst thing that could happen in the movement, is to be accused of being an agent. And there was the famous case of Carlos Aponte, whom I write about, and the injustice that was done to him. And there were other smaller cases. And then in the third phase, when centralism and the move to Puerto Rico, then there was even internal beatings that were orchestrated by the Central Committee in order to impose, or by that faction of the Central Committee in order to impose. Because, and when I say I was part of the opposition, that's how I wound up in Philadelphia working in a factory. Because I didn't agree that the move to Puerto Rico should be the priority of the Young Lords. I saw it more along the lines of what Victor was talking about. And so I did go to work in a factory, to organize. Untrained, didn't know what I was doing, and wasn't successful, truth be told. Because you just don't walk into a place and you don't know what you're doing and you think you're going to organize the working class. Especially when the working class, I was working with Italian garment workers que no hablaban inglés, y, I would try, so it didn't work. And when I showed up, myself and one other comrade showed up to a union meeting, it was all Italian, all white Italian men, and they turned to us and they said, "What are you doing here?" Right? So they knew that we were organizers, right from the beginning, because why else would we show up at a union meeting, right? But I do want to make a statement about also the race and the woman question, because it wasn't that everybody was saying, socialism will take care of it. Within the movements, we had women that were saying, no, it has to be part of the revolution. Now, what kind of a society are we going to create if we're going to wait for later? We have no guarantees. Your practice hasn't shown us that we're going to be free later. So we can't really trust what you're saying. It has to be now. So I participated in forming the Women's Union, the Women's Caucus within the Young Lords, which was basically to say, we're not inferior. That was our first struggle. I mean, today you can't even imagine, are you for real? We were saying, we're not inferior. So that was our first struggle, was to say we're not inferior. And then to say that we want to organize in the community, and then to the various struggles we wanted to be part of. And then we organized in the second stage a women's union, which was to organize women in the community around all of these issues, and always talking about gender and racial justice together. But there was a political line struggle that said, no, the priority is the revolution, and these are secondary struggles, meaning race and gender are secondary struggles. We were even called left-wing infantile for raising those issues of anti-racism and anti-patriarch or pro-patriarchy. And so there was a very heavy line struggle, and it was squashed within the Young Lords. It was squashed so that the line became, we're making the revolution, and then when Puerto Rico is independent, then we can deal with the woman and race issue. So we still wouldn't be dealing with the woman and the race issue, right? That's what we're saying. So I just wanted to clarify that it wasn't only in the Puerto Rican community, but this was a big issue in the African American community. Black feminism developed in reaction to that attitude that, your issues are not important. Because what we were saying is, for a society to be free, we all have to be free. How are you gonna have a society where only the men are free?
That's the answer to the second question to Generation Z. Don't do that. But if we can maybe just go to the audience, because we have like 12 minutes left before it's noon, which is when we're supposed to wrap up. So for the audience here, there's 2 microphones. So we'll just go to you.
Hi, good morning. Marina Ortiz from El Barrio here. And my question is kind of rhetorical. How do we, and I'm sorry, I am going to go back and forth, I don't care, but how do we continue to honor and especially uphold our radical traditions today when our own institutions are condemning and even censoring artists at El Museo del Barrio who included a Palestinian flag in their exhibition? They were censored. Here at CUNY, we've had educators who've been fired for speaking out. And it's total, absolute silence. I don't hear the left, the Puerto Rican leadership speaking out about that, and that's an issue for me. So how do we honestly and genuinely continue to uphold our traditions? Thank you.
Hello, I'm actually a 3L in CUNY Law. So I just kind of wanted to know, the school kind of focuses on like radical lawyering and what's that next step. I want to know if you guys knew kind of like a new way in which a new age lawyer like me can kind of be a little bit more active in this space and kind of make sure that, again, we're uplifting these roots now.
I can just give a brief response to that. I think part of what we're doing here is whatever the field you're going to get involved with and you want to do radical work, or you want to affect the inequities, economic and social, and gender and LGBTQ that exist. One is to study history, to study radical history, to understand what the facts and the events were that took place that led to the emergence of groups and the actions they took to address those realities, but also to put it within the frame of identifying truths and trying to achieve justice. Because achieving justice is more complicated than it seems. But really about justice is you have to really work harder at looking at how you solve problems, people's problems, so that you don't just make a decision based on a majority position, but look at the implications of the decisions being made, whether you within a group or the society, that affect, minorities, people that are not part of the majority. What actions are being taken to address that the issues that those people are raising, the concerns that they're raising, the impacts that they're raising are considered, so that they're part of a solution that's not just about that satisfies the majority, but satisfies everybody affected, particularly the people who are history of being oppressed and are being outside the concerns of the people who rule the society. So the pursuit of truth and trying to achieve justice, it's not an easy process, it's a challenging process, but that's what being a radical means if you want to avoid some of the mistakes that we made, because the more, when we applied those principles, is when we were at our most effective.
And maybe let me just add, movement lawyers are always necessary. Movement lawyers have been key. Movement lawyers have gotten together and created the People's Law Office in Chicago, which does local defense, but has also done historical defense of Puerto Rican political prisoners and other folks who've been attacked by the state for a long time, right? You are not gonna get lawyer money, but you'll be doing the people a favor, right? And so there are groups that constantly try to get lawyers involved. The info is not that hard to find. It's out there. And then just one last thing to add, there's a lot of new generation organizations, popping up left and right, a lot of them on Instagram. And part of the reason for doing this was to try to actually create links. Because one of the things that I remember my generation learning from their generation was them talking about the links that were broken from their generation to the people before. One thing Edis was talking about was, the old Communist Party that exists in the United States, the PC USA, had a bulletin in their newspaper geared to the Puerto Rican community, right? A whole section for the Puerto Rican community, right? There was attempts to make those relationships, and she was asking, where are those connections now? It was something that she remembers they didn't tap into. It existed, and there was a broken link there, right? And so this was an attempt to also try to make sure that there's not as many broken links between the generations currently. So this is also all the new organizations, we gotta link up. I know we're running out of time. Do we have one more question? Ian, yeah.
Hi, first of all, thank you for being here. It's been an honor to learn so much from all of you, and it's just a testament to the importance of history for current political struggles. So I just want to ask a question to all of you regarding your current view of what's happening in the island with the crisis of politics there, in terms of how people understand politics. Where usually for decades now, politics has been centered on the colonial status situation of the island. And now it seems that there's been an opening up of the political space in terms of understanding that material grievances have to be addressed. And solving the colonial status of the island might have to wait because of those material grievances that have to be addressed. And I say that because many of us have understood that independence is a necessary but not a sufficient condition, given the history of the local elites, the capitalist class. Victor put a lot of emphasis on the importance of the analysis of the class structure of the island and stuff like that. And many of us think that even by obtaining a Republican independent status, that class structure is still going to be there. It's the same elites that have looted the public coffers, for example, of the island. So I just wonder, what's your view of the current political situation where seems to be an opening up of the space of opportunity of views in the island? And if, Saulo, if you don't mind quick advertising, I teach at John Jay College economics, and the name of Karl Marx has been floated around. John Jay College is a Hispanic serving institution. 47% of the student body is Hispanic. Most of them are Puerto Rican and Dominican, and the teaching of Karl Marx is a required course for our students. So hopefully that also helps a little bit. So yes.
So let me try to combine a little bit of what he's asking with a question that was asked online, and just quickly, right? So yeah, the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party barely exists, but I mean it does exist historically speaking, right? Its level of activity, it depends how you're connected to them. There's a lot of historical stuff, right, that folks do, and as Marina questioned, sometimes our institutions don't do as good a job or actually become part of the problem, and it's up to those other organizations to hold them accountable, right? So where are those organizations? It's a weird time, right? There's all kinds of projects in Puerto Rico that folks have seen, right? You have, La Colectiva doing stuff, Jornada, you have campaigns that are trying to lift off the ground, like the Puerto Rico No Se Vende campaign, right? There are projects out there that people are trying to build. You can find that information and try to join, right? People are trying to create organizations, learning some of the lessons from older organizations so that we don't repeat the same errors and end up here another generation down the line, right? And then maybe not having that kind of push that like Che was talking about, like this revolution around the corner, long haul, right? Or that's a really long corner, right? And so we need to be real about that, but sometimes the needs are so pressing, the destruction, as Edith was pointing out, is so bad, right? That you're looking for something transformative. And so we can understand that. So there are organizations, some of these are debatable in terms of what success they're gonna do, right? Chair points out that the electoral stuff really divided the organizations. Right now, there's an electoral project in Puerto Rico that folks are wondering, is it gonna go somewhere, right? Movimiento Victoria Ciudadana, is it gonna capture some kind of interest enough to break the bipartisan situation, part of Ian's question, or not? For sectors of the left, that is unheard of, right? That there can be no electoral solution. Probably not if the electoral solution means the total transformation of this capitalist colony into something that is a socialist republic that includes all the intersectional issues that Edith points out, right? Algo tan profundo is not going to come purely probably through electoral, but ¿dónde estamos, right? How far can we push that electoral, right? These are some of the questions that folks are trying to engage. Do we engage by not engaging, right? And just see what happens? This is part of the questions that we wanted to discuss con ustedes today. And in the minuto y medio que nos queda, right? I asked the panelists if they want to give a final 30-second words.
I just want to give one summary. All of us are still out there. The Puerto Rican radical tradition, even these organizations don't exist. I run into cadre all over the country, organizing independently. They may not be, our organizations may not exist. The biggest challenge we have, and then I can stop, is that we have to convince our people of the necessity and the possibility of independence for Puerto Rico. We haven't gotten there yet. And that when we do that, then we can be talking about some major transformation, but it's a process. And the reality is, it's not revolution around the corner. It's that we haven't convinced the great majority of our people of the necessity and the possibility of that transformation.
I want to add that, history goes through ebbs and flows. And one of the things that I think that we're in a moment that we have to break out of the boxes. Is it electoral? Is it organizing? We have to see what the conditions are and use all of the tactics that we can. And in terms of feeling isolated in this moment, well, yes and no. And if you're isolated, when we were organizing against the war in Vietnam, we were also isolated. It's a time to organize. It means that you have to stand up, that's it. And maybe it's one, maybe it's you unite with another person, two makes two, then two more, and that's how we grow. There are times in the movement where, we would be invited and there'd be nobody in the audience. We're invited and there's, all of you all are here. And plus we have people, watching. This is a good moment. So we should focus on that. And remember, fascism is like breathing down our necks, like no other time. Well, we did have another time. But
Many times.
We had many times. But we're in a very difficult time where we have to, so we have to say we use all tactics and organize. And the other thing I want to say is that we need to be kind to each other. We need to treasure each other. Porque no somos tantos, so we need to love each other. And that aspect also has to come into our politics. Because in the old days, it was just all the theory. And, that got us to a bad place when we stopped showing serve the people and love the people. So that's how I want to end.
Y vamos a dejarlo ahí.
Okay, mi gente, thank you once again to all our wonderful panelists from panel 1. I do want to remind you that we have 2 more panels. We are going to break for lunch. Quickly, before we go, I just want to reinforce some of the things that the panel said at the end there. The Puerto Rican radical tradition is very much alive. The PSP might not exist. The Partido Nacionalista might be kind of mainly about doing rituals and historical stuff, but there are dozens, literally dozens of organizations. My own research looks into them, and at the beginning of my introduction, I had a slide about the Red de Solidaridad con Palestina. As you can see, there's over a dozen, maybe 15 or more logos right up there. Those are all different radical organizations. There's tons of debate, right? That's Saulo is saying, but it's a sign that the radical tradition is very much alive. So anyone who is interested and who is listening on Zoom or with us here today, check them out. Go online. All of them have online presence. Unfortunately, we don't have the time or resources right now to give you, a breakdown. But they're out there. So hopefully this event is a good start for those people who are interested to start looking into it and linking up.